Hey guys, tonight we're starting something that feels a little different, but also very much the same. So, get cozy, dim the lights, settle in with a pillow, maybe a blanket, and prepare to slowly drift off to the soothing story of kings who were supposed to rule, but didn't quite manage to keep the job. Because let's be honest, being a king was basically the medieval equivalent of working at a startup that constantly burned through staff. Everyone thought the role was glamorous, but in reality the hours were long, the co-workers were terrible, and the chance of being forced into early retirement was surprisingly high. So tonight, we're going to wander through the quiet, overlooked, slightly sad lives of kings who lost their crowns and then had to figure out what to do next. Spoiler, it usually involved castles that felt suspiciously like prisons, monks with very judgmental eyebrows, and way too much embroidery time. Let's start with one of the more theatrical losers of the crown lottery, Richard II of England. Richard II came to the throne in 1377 at the tender age of 10, which, if you think about it, is around the same time most kids are still figuring out long division, or in his case, figuring out how to balance a very heavy crown on a very small head. He was the grandson of Edward III, a king who had done a fairly decent job of expanding England's military reputation, and the son of Edward the Black Prince, who had been a war hero but inconveniently died before he could actually inherit anything. So Richard got bumped up to the top of the list. A child king, which sounds adorable in theory, but in practice was like giving the CEO position of a multinational company to a sixth grader. He had regents, advisors, and noble caretakers, all of whom spent more time clawing at each other for influence than worrying about the boy himself. Now, Richard grew up with a very high opinion of kingship. He believed in something called the divine right of kings, which basically meant, in his mind, that God himself had personally mailed him the crown with a celestial warranty. It was not to be questioned. He took this idea so seriously that he often treated nobles as if they were irritating background characters in his personal royal drama. And unfortunately, when you're king, the nobles are not the background characters. They're the ones holding the swords. One of the earliest messes Richard faced was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Imagine tens of thousands of angry workers with pitchforks storming into London, demanding things like, "Maybe don't tax us into oblivion," and "Could we not die of famine, thanks?" Richard, at only 14, actually rode out to meet them, which was bold, and kind of the medieval equivalent of a teenager being sent to break up a fight at a biker bar. But here's the twist. He did okay. The peasants were impressed by how calm he seemed, and Richard promised them reforms. Of course, once the revolt was over, he immediately walked those promises back and ordered mass executions, because nothing says leadership quite like betraying people who already didn't like you. That pretty much set the tone for Richard's reign. As he grew older, Richard developed a taste for extravagance. He loved art, elaborate clothing, and ceremonies that made him look majestic. He wasn't exactly a king of the people. He was more like that one relative who insists on wearing a velvet cape to Thanksgiving dinner, just because it feels regal. He also had a sharp temper. At one point, he banished his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who, you may recognize, later returned as Henry IV. Big mistake, because when you banish a cousin with money, power, and ambition, they rarely spend their exile quietly knitting. By 1399, Richard had alienated just about everyone who mattered: nobles, parliament, his own extended family, even the people who had originally supported him. Henry Bolingbroke came back from exile, gathered an army, and found Richard's support base so weak that he barely had to try. Richard was deposed almost effortlessly. Now, here's the part that interests us tonight. What happens to a king after he's no longer king? Richard was locked away in Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire. It's one of those castles that looks scenic now, but back then was probably drafty, damp, and endlessly boring. No feasts, no grand courts, just stone walls, guards, and an ex-king wandering the halls, probably rehearsing speeches about how everyone had misunderstood him. There are a few accounts of his final months. Some sources say he refused food, basically starving himself to death in a dramatic sulk. Others claim he was quietly murdered on Henry IV's orders. The truth? Hard to say. What's more certain is that Richard, who believed so deeply in his divine right to rule, ended his days not as God's chosen monarch, but as a forgotten prisoner. And that's the pattern we'll keep seeing tonight. Kings who thought they were untouchable, only to find themselves demoted to that guy in the corner tower. Let's float now from Richard's cold, echoing castle in England to another dethroned royal disaster, this time from France. So, let's float gently over from the damp stones of Pontefract Castle in England, where Richard II sulked himself into oblivion, to the gilded but equally humiliating end of another king who couldn't quite keep his grip on the crown. Charles X of France. Now, Charles is one of those royals who looks more like a footnote than a headline. He ruled from 1824 to 1830, which sounds respectable enough, but he also happens to be the last king of the senior Bourbon line, basically the last guy in the family to hold the title before things went permanently sideways. He was born in 1757, which means he was around for all the French Revolution chaos, the Napoleonic roller coaster, and then somehow still managed to grab the crown after all that. Think of him as that one guy in the group project who does absolutely nothing for 3 hours, then shows up at the very end to slap his name on the PowerPoint slide. Charles wasn't exactly destined for brilliance. He was the youngest brother of Louis XVI, the king who famously lost his head during the Revolution, and of Louis XVIII, who became king after Napoleon was politely asked to stop conquering Europe. By the time Charles got his turn, the Bourbons had already been kicked out once, restored once, and were basically hanging on by the royal equivalent of duct tape. But Charles didn't seem to notice. He thought his reign was going to be the triumphant return of old-school monarchy, as if the revolution had just been a bad dream. He doubled down on divine right, ignored public opinion, and acted like France was still stuck in the year 1750. Which, spoiler, it was not. Charles was also deeply unpopular for his personal style. He was old-fashioned, stiff, and about as inspiring as a soggy baguette. While younger French elites were reading liberal newspapers and sipping coffee in Paris cafes, Charles was busy reviving elaborate court rituals and surrounding himself with ultra-royalists who wanted everything back the way it was. For a country that had already executed one Bourbon king and only grudgingly accepted the next, this was not a winning strategy. The breaking point came in July 1830, when Charles basically decided to cancel freedom of the press, dissolve the Chamber of Deputies, and rewrite the electoral rules to favour his supporters. A kind of medieval throwback move in a modern age, it was called the July Ordinances. France responded with the July Revolution, which, as you might guess, ended with Charles packing his bags. So, what happens when a Bourbon king gets dethroned in 1830? Exile. Lots and lots of exile. Charles fled Paris, first hiding out in Rambouillet, then making his way to England, which by this point was becoming the go-to Airbnb for unemployed monarchs. England had a whole tradition of housing dethroned kings, provided they didn't stir up too much trouble. Charles arrived there looking less like a majestic king and more like a tired grandfather who had lost his reading glasses. And to be fair, he was tired. He was 73 years old, which, for the 1830s, was practically ancient. Being kicked out of office at that age is kind of like being told to find a new career right after you've already retired. The British were polite enough to offer Charles a roof over his head. He stayed at Holyrood Palace in Scotland for a while, which is one of those places that sounds glamorous but is really just damp stone walls with slightly nicer tapestries. He also wandered around England for a bit, but he never fit in. The English weren't exactly enthusiastic about hosting the human embodiment of unpopular monarchy. So Charles eventually moved on to Prague, then further into the Habsburg lands, finally settling in a quiet corner of what's now Slovenia. Imagine going from Versailles to rural Slovenia. That's the royal equivalent of trading in a Ferrari for a donkey cart. His final years were quiet, uneventful, and, honestly, kind of boring. Which is fitting. He spent his time praying, writing letters, and probably complaining about how the youth had no respect anymore. He died in 1836 of cholera because nothing says royal exit quite like a painfully ordinary disease that was also killing thousands of non-kings at the time. So, Charles X ended, not with a guillotine, not with fireworks, but with a quiet whimper in exile, forgotten by most, overshadowed by revolutions, and remembered today mostly as the king who thought turning back the clock was a good political strategy. Spoiler again, it wasn't. And there you have it, another king who once imagined himself the centre of history, only to spend his final years as an irrelevant old man in a rented palace. Let's now gently wander away from Charles's cholera-ridden exile in Slovenia and glide back across the channel to another monarch who got the royal pink slip. This time, one who made a bit more of a dramatic exit, James II of England. So, let's drift gently from Charles X's sad exile in Slovenia back across the channel to England in the late 1600s. Here, we meet James II, a man who really wanted to be king, but, unfortunately, also wanted to be Catholic. And in 17th century England, that combination was about as popular as opening a vegan butcher shop in Texas. James was born in 1633, the second surviving son of Charles I. Yes, that Charles I, the one who got his head cut off during the English Civil War. So right off the bat, James's family resume was not exactly confidence-inspiring. If you're the child of a beheaded monarch, people don't exactly line up to put crowns on your head. After the whole regicide incident, James spent years in exile, while England experimented with being a republic under Oliver Cromwell. He grew up abroad, served in foreign armies, and generally stewed in resentment until the monarchy was restored in 1660 with his older brother, Charles II. Charles II, James's big brother, was witty, charming, and thoroughly irresponsible. He was nicknamed the Merry Monarch because he had endless parties, mistresses, and illegitimate children, but not a single legitimate heir. James, by contrast, was not merry. He was more like the grumpy uncle who complains about everything at family gatherings, stern, humourless, and, inconveniently, very Catholic. Now, religion was the political landmine of the age. England had been Protestant for over a century, and anti-Catholic sentiment ran deep. People still remembered Mary I burning Protestants at the stake, the Spanish Armada, and all that fun stuff. So when James converted to Catholicism, it was about as popular as announcing that he had joined a cult. But despite this glaring flaw, or rather because Charles II refused to produce a legitimate heir, James eventually became king in 1685. At first, people tried to be cautiously optimistic. Maybe James would be one of those kings who kept his personal religion personal and ruled pragmatically. Spoiler, he did not. James immediately set about promoting Catholics into high office, repealing laws that discriminated against them, and generally trying to roll back Protestant dominance, which, from a modern perspective, might sound like religious tolerance. But from the perspective of 17th century English Protestants, it looked like the beginning of another Inquisition. It didn't help that James wasn't exactly subtle. He marched Catholic troops into London, dismissed judges who didn't agree with him, and demanded that Anglican clergy read out his pro-Catholic declarations from the pulpit. Subtlety was not his strong suit, and then, of course, came the baby. James had 2 adult daughters from his first marriage, Mary and Anne. Both were Protestant, and the nation kind of assumed that one of them would inherit the throne, which made James's reign tolerable. People figured they could just endure him, like waiting out a bad landlord, and eventually the crown would return to a Protestant heir. But in 1688, James's much younger Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Suddenly there was a Catholic male heir in the picture, and the English political elite basically panicked. A Catholic dynasty stretching into the future? Absolutely not. So, in a move that would later be branded the Glorious Revolution, though I suspect James didn't find it particularly glorious, they invited James's Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange to swoop in and take the throne. James's downfall was both dramatic and pathetically undignified. When William of Orange landed with his army, many of James's own supporters defected almost instantly. Even his daughter Anne abandoned him, which has to rank high on the list of awkward family betrayals. James tried to flee, throwing the Great Seal of England into the Thames in a half-baked attempt to paralyse government. The seal was later fished out by some fishermen, which is about as metaphorical as history gets. A symbol of royal authority literally pulled out of the mud by guys in boats. James was captured once, allowed to escape, then captured again, and finally, in what might have been the most passive-aggressive decision in English history, William of Orange simply let him go. Because honestly, no one wanted to deal with the drama of putting another king on trial. They just wanted him out. So James sailed off into exile, the crown slipping quietly out of his hands. And what did the rest of James's life look like, post-throne? Well, in exile he did what so many dethroned kings did, sulked, plotted, and wrote long, tedious letters insisting he was still the rightful monarch. He spent his later years in France, living off the generosity of Louis XIV, who supported him partly out of sympathy and partly out of spite toward England. James tried to stage a comeback in Ireland in 1689, but that ended with his defeat at the Battle of the Boyne. After that, his chances were basically zero. He lived another decade, fading into obscurity at the Château of Saint-Germain-en-Laye outside Paris. He died in 1701, not with a bang, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had once worn a crown, and now had only his memories and an increasingly irrelevant claim to a throne he'd never see again. And that's James II, a man whose downfall was less about personal incompetence and more about choosing the wrong religion at the wrong time in the wrong country. Let's now float from James's gloomy exile in France to yet another monarch who couldn't hold on to the job. This time, one who was deposed not by religion, but by sheer political clumsiness. Edward II of England. So, let's float gently backward in time, away from the powdered wigs of the 1600s, and back into the mud and castles of the early 1300s. Tonight's unlucky king is Edward II of England, sometimes called one of the worst kings in English history, which, given the competition, is really saying something. Edward was born in 1284, the son of Edward I, who was one of the more intimidating monarchs England ever produced. Edward I was tall, fierce, and went around conquering places like Wales and Scotland with the casual determination of a man who just couldn't stand seeing other people happy. He earned the nickname Hammer of the Scots, which sounds very metal but mostly meant guy who spent a lot of time invading Scotland. So imagine being Edward II, growing up in the shadow of this warlord father. It was like being the son of a terrifying gym coach when all you really wanted to do was sit around and play with your art supplies. Edward II had some very particular interests. Instead of war, strategy, or ruling, he liked thatched cottages, rustic crafts, rowing boats, hanging out with commoners. He even liked digging ditches for fun, which, to be fair, is technically good exercise, but not exactly what your nobles want to see in their future king. And then there was Piers Gaveston. Edward had a very close relationship with this charming Gascon nobleman. Very close. The kind of close that made people whisper in corridors. Gaveston was witty, fashionable, and had a knack for mocking the English barons, which, as you might imagine, didn't endear him to the people holding all the swords. Edward adored him, showered him with titles and wealth, and even left him in charge of the kingdom when he went off to France to get married. Yes, you heard that right. Edward literally trusted Gaveston more than his own bride, and the nobles were furious. When Edward married Isabella of France in 1308, a political alliance with a powerful royal house, it was supposed to stabilize things. Instead, it turned into a spectacular mess. Isabella was young, clever, and probably expected at least a little attention from her new husband. Instead, Edward doted on Gaveston, who strutted around court making enemies. At one point, he even mocked Isabella's French relatives by giving them insulting nicknames, always a good way to win friends. The nobles eventually forced Edward to exile Gaveston, but Edward brought him back almost immediately because of course he did. This back and forth ended when Gaveston was captured and executed by angry barons in 1312. Edward was devastated, like full-on dramatic grief. Meanwhile, Isabella must have been standing there thinking, really? This is my life now? And things only went downhill from there. Edward was not a natural leader. He lost disastrously to the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce handed him one of the most humiliating defeats in English history. Imagine thousands of English soldiers trudging home demoralized, while Edward sulked in the background. His reputation never recovered. Then came his new favourites, the Despenser family. Edward latched onto them with the same intensity he'd shown Gaveston, showering them with wealth and land. Once again, the nobles hated it. Once again, rebellion followed. It was like Edward never learned that playing favourites in a feudal monarchy is basically asking for civil war. And then there was Isabella. Poor Isabella. She had been sidelined for years, ignored in favour of Edward's boyfriends and court pets. Eventually she'd had enough. She travelled to France, met Roger Mortimer, a nobleman with ambitions and a very convenient sense of timing, and together they decided to take Edward down. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a relatively small force, and here's the thing, nobody really tried to stop them. Edward was so unpopular that nobles and towns practically rolled out the red carpet for Isabella's army. Edward fled, wandering from place to place, desperately trying to find supporters. But it was over. He was captured, forced to abdicate in favour of his teenage son Edward III, and locked away. Now we reach the what happens after part. Edward II spent his final months as a prisoner, first in Kenilworth Castle, which sounds lovely but was basically just house arrest with extra guards. Later, he was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. The official story is that he died in 1327, probably murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer. And yes, this is where the famous and probably apocryphal story comes in, the one about the red-hot poker. Chroniclers later claimed he was killed by having a burning poker shoved in a place where burning pokers do not belong. It's the kind of story medieval writers loved to spread because it was gruesome, humiliating, and impossible to fact-check. More likely, Edward was quietly strangled, which, while less sensational, fits the general pattern of dethroned monarchs meeting sad, quiet ends far from the throne. Edward II's story is basically one long tale of mismanagement. A king who preferred ditch-digging to governing, who lost battles, alienated his nobles, and ultimately got ousted by his own wife. He's remembered not for achievements, but for being one of the easiest monarchs to depose. And once again, we see the theme: kings who thought the crown guaranteed them respect, only to discover it was just a shiny hat that could be taken away the moment they annoyed the wrong people. Let's drift now, leaving Edward in his cold cell at Berkeley Castle, and float ahead to another dethroned royal, this time one from much later history, who spent more time writing sad letters in exile than ruling anything: Napoleon III of France. So, let's drift softly into the world of Napoleon III, a man who was, quite literally, the sequel nobody asked for. Born in 1808, Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was the nephew of the Napoleon. Yes, the short, hat-wearing conqueror everyone knows. That connection was both his biggest asset and his biggest curse. On one hand, he had the magic surname. On the other hand, it was like being the younger sibling of a superstar athlete when you can barely dribble a basketball. From the very beginning, he was branded as Napoleon's heir, even though his uncle was already in exile by the time he was a kid. And yet, somehow, this second-rate Bonaparte actually managed to become Emperor of France. Twice. Which was quite the accomplishment for a man whose main skill seemed to be persistence mixed with delusion. Napoleon III first tried to seize power in 1836 with a bizarre coup attempt in Strasbourg. He showed up with a few soldiers, gave a speech invoking his uncle's glory, and assumed people would just join him. Spoiler, they did not. He was arrested and politely shipped off to America. A few years later, he tried again, this time in Boulogne in 1840. He actually brought an eagle with him, because apparently he thought the bird would inspire loyalty. Instead, the coup collapsed instantly. The eagle probably looked confused, and Napoleon was thrown into prison for 6 years. Now, you'd think 6 years in jail would break a man's ambition. But Napoleon III spent that time writing books, plotting, and insisting that destiny still had his back. And in 1846, he escaped. Literally just walked out dressed as a workman. Which sounds ridiculous, but it worked. His big break came in 1848, when the French Revolution of that year toppled King Louis Philippe and left the country scrambling for leadership. France held presidential elections, and somehow Napoleon III won in a landslide. Not because people thought he was competent, but because his name reminded them of his much cooler uncle. It was pure brand recognition. His big break came in 1848, when the French Revolution of that year toppled King Louis Philippe and left the country scrambling for leadership. France held presidential elections, and somehow Napoleon III won in a landslide. Not because people thought he was competent, but because his name reminded them of his much cooler uncle. It was pure brand recognition. As president, Napoleon III was supposed to be restrained by a constitution, but of course that wasn't his style. In 1851, when his term was about to expire, he staged a coup, dissolved Parliament, and declared himself emperor the following year, and so began the Second French Empire. Now, to be fair, Napoleon III wasn't completely useless. In the 1850s, his empire saw some modernization. Paris got its grand boulevards, industry expanded, and for a while things looked almost stable. But the man had the fatal flaw of believing he was a military genius like his uncle. He was not. Napoleon III dabbled in wars. Some went okay, like the Crimean War, where France and Britain teamed up against Russia. Others, like his adventure in Mexico, where he tried to install a puppet emperor named Maximilian, went disastrously. The whole thing ended with Maximilian getting executed, which was awkward for everyone involved. But Napoleon III's real undoing came with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. He thought it would be a quick, glorious victory. Instead, the French army collapsed almost immediately, and Napoleon himself was captured at the Battle of Sedan. Imagine being an emperor, riding confidently into war and then suddenly finding yourself a prisoner of the enemy. Not a great look. So, what happens to an emperor after capture? Napoleon III was shipped off to Germany, humiliated, and forced to surrender. His empire collapsed overnight. Paris declared itself a republic, and just like that, Napoleon III was out of a job. After his release, he fled to England because apparently England had become the international retirement home for dethroned monarchs. He settled in Chislehurst in Kent with his wife Eugenie and their young son. His life in exile was quiet and pitiful. No grand palaces, no parades, just rainy English weather and the knowledge that he had lost everything. He spent his time gardening, writing sad memoirs, and visiting doctors for a painful kidney condition. He died in 1873 after surgery for bladder stones, which is perhaps the least glorious way an emperor could possibly go out. Not on the battlefield, not in exile plotting a comeback, but in an English villa after a failed medical procedure. Napoleon III's story is one of those historical ironies. A man who wanted desperately to be like his uncle, but ended up remembered more for defeats than victories. His empire crumbled, his dynasty ended, and his legacy is mostly the guy who lost to Bismarck. And once again, we see the same theme. Kings and emperors who thought they were chosen by destiny, only to discover that history is more interested in humbling them than glorifying them. So, let's gently leave Napoleon III in his rainy English exile and drift toward another dethroned ruler, one who combined extravagance with a spectacular crash, the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, Charles I. So, let's float gently into the early 20th century. The year is 1916, the middle of World War I. And into this absolute disaster of a situation walks Charles I of Austria-Hungary. Charles wasn't supposed to be emperor. Not really. He was relatively far down the Habsburg family tree. His great-uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, had been ruling since 1848, which means Charles grew up in a world where the old man seemed practically immortal. But then fate did what fate usually does in the Habsburg dynasty. Cleared out everyone else with a mixture of tragedy, assassination, and poor genetics. First, Franz Joseph's only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, shot himself in the scandalous Meerling incident. Then Franz Ferdinand, yes, the Archduke who took a fatal car ride in Sarajevo, was assassinated in 1914. That left Charles, the backup heir no one had really prepared for, suddenly promoted to centre stage. And so, at the age of 29, Charles became Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary in 1916. Congratulations, Charles. Here's your empire. Oh, and by the way, it's falling apart, the army is exhausted, and the world war you just inherited is going terribly. Good luck. Charles actually wasn't a bad person, which almost makes his story sadder. He was young, earnest, and genuinely wanted to bring peace. He was devoted to his wife, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, and doted on his children. Compared to the usual Habsburg cocktail of arrogance, inbreeding, and complete detachment, Charles looked almost normal, but normal doesn't save empires. Charles tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies behind Germany's back. In 1917, he even used his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, as a secret messenger to France. This little scheme is known as the Sixtus Affair. It might have worked, except, of course, it didn't. The details leaked, Germany was furious, and Charles ended up looking both weak and duplicitous. Meanwhile, back home, Austria-Hungary was unraveling like an old sweater. The empire was a messy patchwork of ethnic groups: Czechs, Hungarians, Croats, Poles, Italians, you name it. And they were all tired of being ruled from Vienna. Charles tried reforms like offering federal autonomy, but by then it was too late. Nationalism had taken root, and no amount of well-meaning Habsburg hand-waving was going to stop it. By late 1918, the empire was collapsing. Hungary declared independence. Czechoslovakia popped into existence. South Slavs joined together to form what would become Yugoslavia. Even Austria itself seemed to be falling apart at the seams. On November 11th, 1918, yes, the exact same day World War I officially ended, Charles issued a statement relinquishing participation in government. Notice the wording. He never formally abdicated. He was still clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, the crown was his by divine right. But practically speaking, he was done. And so, Charles and his family went into exile. First in Switzerland, which seems to have been Europe's polite storage locker for spare royals. Then, after a failed comeback attempt, he was shipped off much farther away. Yes, Charles actually tried to get his throne back. Twice. In 1921, he made not one but 2 attempts to return to Hungary and reclaim his crown. He snuck back in, convinced he could rally supporters. The problem was, Hungary wasn't really in the mood. The new government, led by Admiral Miklos Horthy, politely told Charles to leave. Twice. Imagine trying to crash your own coronation and being turned away like an uninvited wedding guest. After that, the Allies decided Charles was becoming too much of a nuisance, so they bundled him off to Madeira, a small Portuguese island in the Atlantic Ocean. It was beautiful, but also isolated, and Charles was effectively under house arrest. And that's where his story ends. Charles lived in a rented villa, far from the palaces of Vienna and Budapest. The climate was damp, the funds were limited, and he spent his days quietly with his family. In 1922, just 4 years after losing his throne, Charles caught pneumonia. He died at the age of only 34. He left behind a widow, Empress Zita, and 8 children. Zita would live on for decades, wandering through exile, always insisting that her husband had been the rightful emperor. Charles himself was eventually beatified by the Catholic Church in 2004, remembered more as a pious family man than a ruler. But politically, he's remembered as the last Habsburg emperor, the man who inherited a crumbling empire and couldn't hold it together, not because he was cruel or incompetent, but simply because the age of empires was over. So, Charles I of Austria-Hungary ended not with a guillotine or a bloody coup, but with exile on a damp island, coughing out his final days while the world moved on without him. Another dethroned king, fading into quiet obscurity. And with that, let's gently drift away from Charles's villa on Madeira and move next to a monarch whose fall from power was loud, messy, and endlessly theatrical, Louis Philippe of France, the so-called citizen king.